Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another screencast by your AP Environmental Science teacher, Mr. Stano. And today we're going to take a look at some more population ecology. The sea otter, or the southern sea otter, was hunted quite a bit back in the 1700s and going into the early 1900s, almost basically to the brink of extinction. And then through a series of efforts and stopping the hunt and the hunting pressures getting relieved off them, they're now making a comeback. So what does this mean? Sea otters are a very important keystone species for kelp-eating organisms and also for sea urchins. Really, the populations of sea urchins and a lot of the organisms are going to depend on those southern sea otters. Without sea otters, those sea urchins will eat that kelp, and they'll keep eating and eating and eating, and their population will pretty much boom quite a bit, therefore affecting a number of other populations within the community. So those sea otters, they play a key role in maintaining the balance within those biomes that they're at. So we're going to be looking at just basically how populations change and other populations in response to those changes. One thing that we can look at is how these organisms or how species populations live within their biome or within their area. If we take a look here, we have elephants. And it makes say they'll travel in these packs and they'll be relatively clumped. Usually what happens is they're on their way towards resources, so they'll all follow that same path and be there towards that resource. Versus something like the creosote bush, which has a uniform distribution. The creosote bush actually has chemicals that exudes out in the ground around it that cause other plants nearby to not to grow or to grow to a lesser extent. It's a form of chemical control known as allelopathy, and we'll talk more about that in class. Then there's random. So these dandelions here is basically just on however possibly that the seeds were dispersed, and there really is no rhyme or reason to how that population is put over an area. Populations change basically either in a couple of ways. They can increase due to births or immigration, more individuals coming into an area, or they can decrease due to deaths and emigration, individuals leaving an area. They can also change, or depending on, they'll grow on a certain speed or a certain rate based on the types of individuals or where the individuals are within that population. So what do I mean? So you can have a really young population in their pre-reproductive age. So they're not mature enough to reproduce. So they won't really contribute to the increase in population. Then you have individuals at a reproductive age. They're able to reproduce. And then you'll have people in the post-reproductive age. They're just too old to reproduce. So depending on where your population is situated, it may grow really fast or it may actually decline. So if we look at Japan, for instance, a really old post-reproductive age in that population. So what we see is that as those people die, there's no one really replacing them and the population will decrease. Versus we go to some third world countries where you have a huge amount of people within their reproductive and pre-reproductive age. So you have a lot of people reproducing, and then what happens is those individuals, then their pre-reproductive age, get to the individual, well, they start reproducing. So you get this cycle of kind of pushing that population bigger and bigger and bigger. There are limits on population growth, though. We can look at biotic potential versus environmental resistance. So no population can increase in size indefinitely. There's usually always some sort of limiting factor or something that will control how fast that population grows or how much it will grow. So the intrinsic rate of increase, or lowercase r, is the rate at which a population would grow if it had unlimited resources. It had every chance and opportunity to reproduce and grow. Then what usually happens is we approach K, or the carrying capacity. So this is the maximum population a given species in a particular habitat can sustain indefinitely without degrading the habitat. So basically kind of keeping everything at status quo. This way is a little tough to see, but when we look at it like this, it makes it a little bit easier to look at. The R and K makes a little bit more sense when we put it onto this graph for us to take a look at. So what we have here is some population size increasing, and this area right here, or this J-shaped region right here, is exponential growth. And we see this with human population growth growing exponentially like this. And the biotic potential is basically how rapidly it can grow with unlimited resources. Then what happens is we have environmental resistance. It's basically some sort of limiting factor, whether it's a nutrient, space, any number of things that will cause that population to not grow exponentially anymore, but reach the carrying capacity of the environment. And then you'll notice that it'll kind of wander around the carrying capacity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. So with ample resources, populations will grow rapidly, but become limited as resources become limited, the growth is going to level off. Once we get to that carrying capacity, there's a number of things that can happen. So for instance, here, this population overshoots the carrying capacity. Usually that's due to some sort of reproductive time lapse. So organisms get pregnant, and as time goes on, they just keep having babies, even though they've reached their carrying capacity. Once they do, then you're going to have some dieback. They're going to die off. Some individuals are going to die. And then once again, they're under, and they'll kind of keep oscillating, but getting closer and closer to that carrying capacity. Members of populations that exceed their resources usually end up dying, or they'll move out of the area to find more resources. So with this graph right here, same story, their carrying capacity. They overshoot it, and it dies back. And then once again, it's going to overshoot it again. And then this time it's a big population crash before it gets down below that carrying capacity. It's very typical. We see this also. Now, depending on the type of organism, it may overshoot quite a bit and come back down. And if it's slower reproducing, usually it's not as crazy as this. We'll talk about those types of organisms in a little bit. So over time, species may increase their carrying capacity by developing adaptations, ways to gather new resources. Also, they maintain their carrying capacity by just migrating to other areas where the resources are more plentiful. Humans, we've kind of done a little of everything. We've moved into areas typically before where we haven't been. Technology and other social changes have allowed us to exceed Earth's carrying capacity for humans, or so some people believe. That's open to debate. Population density, or the number of individuals or population found in a particular area, or volume. We'll be studying population density quite a bit when we get to human population growth. Here, not so much, but we know that a population's density can affect how rapidly it can grow or decline. So biotic factors like disease, or those density-dependent factors, will control a population. So by having a huge population density and some sort of disease breaks out, it's very easy for it to transmit, very similar to what we see with Ebola right now, and that will help control population growth. Some factors are not affected by population density. These are density independent factors. Weather, storms, earthquakes, they're going to happen regardless of who's there or not there. So those are density independent factors. There are population sizes may stay the same, increase or decrease in varying regular cycles, or change erratically. And we just give names to this. So a stable population will slightly fluctuate slightly above and below carrying capacity, like I said a little bit earlier. We have eruptive. So what happens is the population will explode, kind of like that one little reindeer example I showed you, and then crash to a more stable level. Cyclic, you always have this kind of like up and down movement around the carrying capacity. And then irregular changes possibly due to chaos or some sort of drastic change. It's just something that happens in the environment that will cause that population to change. Here we have a hare and lynx. And what we'll notice is that the population size of the lynx will kind of be dependent on what's going on with the hare and the resources that it's able to get. So as hare populations increase, the blue line right here, they'll increase. We notice that we see a little bit of an increase in that hare. And then when they decrease, so does the hare population. They don't have, so does the lynx population, they have nothing to eat. And all of a sudden that hare population goes up, and look what happens. The population of the lynx increases too. So they kind of follow each other. They have that similar pattern, offset a little bit. The lynx is offset a little bit from the hare, only because they have to given time to respond to that increase in the hare population. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll end it here for this one. We'll start back up with some more population ecology in a little bit on our next screencast. So I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.